It's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Dan Liggett. His presentation is on the revitalization of Allee Fountain at Newfields, a destination that we're also going to be able to see. So very timely. I'm going to ask people to try and make their way back to their seats. Dan, the floor is yours.
Thank you. What I was telling Dorna earlier is I feel like this is an easy presentation and low pressure presentation to make because you all get to go out to Newfields later. So if I forget to include something, you'll get to see it firsthand later today. And in fact, it was, I think, back in December when Dorna and I were first talking about this conference and this presentation actually at Newfields when we had a meeting there. So it was unique in how it all came together. Before I start, how many people are aware of Newfields or have been there or know of the Indianapolis Museum of Art? Okay, so good. This will be, I think, I'll try to cover a little bit of the basis of Newfields. I'm not necessarily a historian on the property, but I can talk a lot about the fountain, and that's the presentation you'll be hearing today. So this was the fountain last year, and I guess, very similar to the historic vision of the Olmsted Brothers, and I'll get into that in a little bit. But the fountain sits at the end of an alley on center with a large estate house. And so this was when we made our first visits to look at the fountain and to talk about the fountain with Newfields. This is what it looked like. It had a small sprinkler type display. In fact, it was sometimes confused as an irrigation system as you were standing back at the house. But I think what's most important about this photo, and I think we've all probably seen landscapes that include this type of design device, but when Percival Gallagher, who at the time of this design was not a partner at the Olmsted Brothers, but was an associate there, the firm or Percival designed this to include a ha-ha. And a ha-ha is a grading technique in which you can disguise certain features in the landscape. So there's actually two roads that bifurcate this space, and so from this view, it's very difficult to see that based on the grading plan. And so while we didn't necessarily have any modifications or changes to that, it was an important aspect of the landscape design that we didn't want to miss. And I think it's important that I show that to you in this image. So when you arrive to Newfields, you'll probably be in one of the parking lot, probably near the building. I'm going to step off to the side to point it out. Probably in that area. But the yellow box I've highlighted is the alley that I was just describing, and the alley came after the house, obviously, but it was one of the landscape improvements that the Olmsted Brothers made to Newfields. And there's a few more that I'll describe. So as you make your way from the parking lot, you can more or less go due north and probably access the fountain before the house. To give you a little history if you haven't been there, so the property was purchased by Hugh Landon in 1907. The house was built shortly thereafter in 1912, and it wasn't. There was really modest landscape improvements until 1920. Landon was widowed and remarried, and his new wife, I think, saw more desire to make some improvements, and that's when the Olmsted Brothers were hired. The Landons had gone on a honeymoon in Maine, and inspired by some of the works that they saw there, brought the Olmsted Brothers in 1920. And those drawings for the Allee Fountain were prepared in 1921. There's actually some other work called the Ravine Garden that's not included at all in this presentation. It has, I guess, more of maybe the pastoral look, if you would consider this maybe more of the picturesque. But the fountain would then be constructed in 1923. And then shortly thereafter, J.K. Lilly Jr. would purchase the property, and sometimes you'll hear the estate referred to as the Lilly House. And so when you're out there, you might hear the Lilly House and Gardens be mentioned. This image, I actually have the enlargement of it on the next slide. This image, you can see the fountain is actually there. It's before the 1930s. When Lilly purchased the property in the 30s, there was a lot more work that actually was constructed. There was a pool house constructed very near to the fountain and guest house. So when the guests came over, they kind of had the pool, but the Lillys also had that house to use for their leisure. And then it wasn't until the 60s that the Lilly family donated the property to Oldfields, or donated Oldfields to the Art Association. And then in 2000, it was listed on the National Register, and 2003, it was designated as a National Historic Landmark. There was always ongoing restoration, and continued, obviously, with this presentation. But the campus rebranded as Newfields in 2017, and then in 2025, we revitalized the fountain. And so this is the image. There's no actual date that's known on this particular photo, but the pool house is not constructed, so it's likely to occur sometime after the construction of the fountain, obviously, but before the selling of the property to the Lilly family. So showed you this image earlier. This would have been what that particular fountain looked like. There had been modifications to the fountain over time. The original feature system was more based on city water pressure that had been replaced by just a typical submersible pump. And the limestone cap that you see around the top of the fountain, which is flush with grade, had been replaced about 30 years ago. So one of the first things, obviously, we did was start looking at some of the drawings that Percival Gallagher had worked on. And I mentioned the ha-ha earlier. The grading was really important. In fact, as you get further away from the fountain, he actually started grading in half contours, and so it got very, very flat very quickly. And I think the long-term experience with that grading is the area did tend to hold a little bit of water. Probably not an issue for a single-family estate, but for a art museum, it was difficult for people to navigate around that fountain area. And then at the fountain, well, let me back up a step. Along the entire alley and around the fountain, there was a series of elm trees that were proposed. And then at the fountain itself, there was a proposal for a work of art to be at the terminus. So beyond the fountain, the Three Graces are located. There's not I don't know the provenance on this particular piece, but it was part of Percival Gallagher's selection and introduction as part of the design. So this didn't come in later or in the 2000s. This was a purposeful part of the design vision. And this is that vision implemented. And what's a little difficult to see in this photo are the border garden. So outside of the alley, there's a more pastoral, of course, at the time of this photo, it wasn't as shaded as it is now. The trees have grown quite large. But a border garden that would allow visitors now, or the Lilly or Landon family, to walk from the house out to the fountain. So I think this is a great photo. And another one here, and you can actually see the staking in the foreground. You can see what I would assume be the preparation of the Three Graces. So that kind of gives us some indication that the Graces probably came maybe shortly after the fountain was constructed. So this won't be recognizable to you today when you stand at the fountain and look back towards the Lilly house. The trees are quite large. The branches are kind of over that alley, but you can still see the front door easily and the front of the house quite well. And I know this image is probably difficult to see, and I'm going to zoom in on it a little bit, but this was the actual one of the drawing sheets for the fountain itself. And it was really exciting to look at this and try to figure out, was it built like this? Because it wasn't. and figure out how it was built. But it was just really, I think when we started the project, this was about 102 years ago in the drawing. So that was really exciting. And I'll get to a part of where it felt like Percival and the Olmsted Brothers were there on site with us as we found some of kind of the hidden detailing that didn't necessarily show up in this particular drawing. So that brings me to what we were trying to design and create. I love showing my sketches, so this was one of my first sketches on some of the feedback we were getting from our client, Newfields. My sketches are never known to be like clean or pretty. They're always like, I think the uglier and the faster, the better. That's how I work. So this was one of the first ones, and we were looking at a variety of effects, and that manifested itself in this design. And this design included a central vertical jet, which was important. It felt like it was reminiscent of what was there, maybe just in a more vertical application. The basket weave was probably more representational of the existing feature. But the basket weave has jets that basically create a crossing pattern to make it look like they're crossing. They're actually not, of course. A series of pop jets around the basket weave. And then on the outside, two very fun features. A fog feature, which doesn't require water to be in the fountain. That fog feature is basically just a very high pressurized mist. And that allows that feature to be used throughout the year. So let's say you shut the fountain down and drain the water, you can still run the fog feature for maybe a special spring or fall event. And then on the outside were a smooth bore. And we called this the wedding cake. It was kind of this terrace down to the outside, and then specifically the smooth bore I called kind of the bundt cake of creating that shape back in towards the fountain. So the idea was to create a space that was worth staying in and creating the opportunity for this particular layout to be choreographed to a show. And when you're out there today, I'll probably get this wrong, I think it's at the top of every hour or every half hour, there is a show that has been, the music's been donated by the Indianapolis Symphony Orchestra, and the fountain is choreographed to perform to that show. And they have a variety of other shows that won't be playing while you're out there, but they have different effects that they can choose from. So how did we achieve this, and how can we make, how can this relate back to the drawings I showed you earlier? So to create all those effects, we had to remove the floor of the fountain. That was critical. There was too much plumbing and too much rework, and it would be too much patchwork, if you will, to be able to create those effects by maintaining any type of the existing floor. There were some issues with not issues, but over time, the existing drainage of the fountain that Percival had designed, which was basically a sump pump in the center, was no longer being utilized, and really, I don't think anyone knew how long it hadn't been utilized. So they would just basically stick a pump in the fountain and pump it out to a storm inlet to get rid of that water. So we needed to redo some of the floor of the fountain anyway, just based on the age of the piping that was supposed to be draining water out of the fountain. So we removed the floor. However, we maintained the walls. So the walls were kept within the design of the project. So all of the plumbing that had to be provided for this new feature had to go underneath those walls. And that's where we started thinking about where's the joint? How was this concrete poured? If you looked at the way Percival drew the existing wall detail, I'll show you here in a minute, it was not evident where that was. So we, after the floor was removed, in this photo shows about 6 inches of floor remaining adjacent to the wall. And we had not discovered a joint yet. So I'm like, what type of concrete was being used in the 1920s? Because I want that today. We were having a difficult time finding that particular joint. And then as we started to remove that little 6 inches of concrete on the edge, we found the existing rebar that was coming out of the wall. And we knew the rebar was original to the wall because old rebar typically is square and rebar today is round. So we knew that the rebar was original to the wall, but we were still having an issue finding the joint. And then this was the moment I think was our aha moment. And I remember being on site when we made this discovery. The drawing on the left is what Percival had sketched, and it showed this big radius on the floor. And that was not the case at all. Once the fountain was drained, and Newfields kind of told us it didn't have that much radius. But this was the joint. And I think what was really exciting about this was the joint was just not a vertical connection between two pores, but it was a keyway. So a lot of times you see keyways designed on retaining walls, but in this case, the keyway was a vertical application. And so not only were we able to reuse the existing rebar that came out of the wall to tie the slabs together, but we were able to reuse that existing keyway. And that's where it felt like, even though we were tearing the floor of this out, we were trying to reuse some of those details that, although not drawn, I'm sure Percival and the Landons probably knew about. So we also included maybe a more modern day water stop in this, of course, but that keyway allowed us to make that connection. And then this photo I really like because it kind of shows a lot of what's going on. It shows the rebar coming out, the historic square bar, the keyway at the bottom, and then it shows the sanded finish that we took the kind of a smooth finish off in an effort to redo that finish on the side of the wall. But that historic finish had been done so well, that's where you couldn't find the joint. And then the top of the wall, and I mentioned this a little earlier, this was a little surprising to us. We knew the limestone cap was not original, but there was no documentation on what the condition of the top of the wall looked like. And once the limestone cap had been removed, the top of the wall condition you can see here was not in the best of shape. So there was some rework done to the top of that wall to let it live longer, including, of course, new waterproofing on all the new concrete surface. And this is really in the weeds, but just to show you the amount of pipe that was out there, there's a lot. In fact, this is just a little bit of the pipe that you see. All the equipment for this fountain is about 125 feet away in the basement of the earlier mentioned pool house. So the pool house became useful to us because we could put equipment there that was, pumps are making noise and running. We could locate all that equipment there without sacrificing the experience of Newfields. So we put back in our rebar, our aggregate. You can see all the little nozzles here starting to be located. You can see them working on the wall on the outside. And then this is what it looks like before any of that, any of the waterproofing or final finish coating on the fountain went in. And what's great for you guys is we just had a ribbon cutting, I think it was last week. These are photos from that event. So you will be some of the first to visit the actual fountain. I think it was May 7th or May 8th. So you can actually see that center jet here. You can see the basket weave. You can see the fog effect kind of create that experience. And in addition to the effects that you see here, I mentioned a little bit about some of the drainage issues we had. We tried to put in, we did put in under drains to help alleviate some of the standing water, but there are also pathways now. Before there were no pathways, and now with this feature, there needed to be some ADA accessibility to connect people to and around the fountain. So there's an interior path that is adjacent to the fountain, and then there's an outside path where there's benches located. Anything that was non-fountain related, like these benches, we tried to put outside the view shed of the Allee so it didn't impact what that would look like standing at the Lily House. So just some photos of, you can kind of see all the effects here working, maybe with the exception of the fog, in the basket weave in this case. But as you stand back at the Lily House and you look down the Allee, now there's bulbs planted in that Allee in the spring as part of their spring bloom. You can see that look and effect. And I think what was also exciting about this photo was We were trying to think of the ha-ha backwards in the case of the Allee. We didn't necessarily want to see this paved path come in because it hadn't been there originally. So this photo shows that maybe if you get up a little higher, you could start to see it, but at eye perspective, it's not perceivable, which I was excited about. And then I like to include a few final photos here. We changed the design of the cap a little bit. Given that the pathway was adjacent to the cap, we didn't want families with strollers or visually impaired or just the clumsy of us that walk right out into the fountain. So there's a small lip between the pavement and the new limestone cap, and the cap has and you can actually see it really just on the child's foot here. The cap slopes up a little bit to reinforce that you're kind of entering an area of caution. And then what's really exciting about this are all of the features are lit. I think I'm going to get this number wrong, but there's, I believe, over 50 lights in the fountain. And the lights are RGB white, so they can show a variety of colors or a variety of effects. And the lights are also choreographed to the music that is shown for the fountain. So this is probably the best image of if everything functioning at once: the vertical jet, the basket weave, the pop jets around that basket weave, and then on the outside, the smooth bore jets and the fog effect. So happy to take questions. That concludes my presentation.
So I was kind of surprised to see the size and number of all those pipes in there. Did you use a fountain design company, or did you need a mechanical engineer to help you figure out?
We had to use a fountain design company. Yeah, I know how I've done several fountains. There's splash pads for parks departments and things like that, but fountain design company was critical. So we used a group out of Florida for this particular project. I thought I saw one.
Oh, yeah, I love that here. Gosh, it seems so expensive to keep the existing walls, and like a million times more expensive. And I wonder, like, it seems hard to believe that there wasn't an argument for like taking down the walls. And I wondered how that conversation actually went.
Yeah, that's a great question. We discussed that. It felt a little heavy-handed to just rebuild the entire fountain. And it was challenging to go under the walls. At the same time, we had to get into a basement of a pump house that was, 8-9 feet underground. So excavation wasn't necessarily specifically required just to go under the walls. We were going to have to excavate to get all those pipes to the basement anyway. So I think that helped. I do think there was probably a good amount of cost in reconstructing the walls. We didn't necessarily price that or go down that route, especially since we knew we were going to have to do some excavation anyway. So, yeah.
I'm curious, I have two questions. I'm curious on the cost of the project.
Mm-hmm.
I'm also curious about the maintenance considerations behind something like this. In our water system, it's a nightmare for us to keep on top of water elements just because of all the mechanical failures and replacements and for kind of steering away.
Fountains are notoriously expensive to maintain. I don't think that's any secret. Newfields does have some existing fountains. They have the Sutphin fountain. I believe that was designed by Sasaki. Again, I'm not great on all the history of their features. They have another fountain, and you'll see it's the Four Seasons fountain, very close to this, designed by some of the earliest women landscape architects. I am afraid to share costs just because the IMA is a private institute. But the Glick family was fortunate enough to make a donation towards the fountain, why it's kind of taking that namesake. Within the pump house itself, though, there are a variety of filters, both sand filter that you would imagine and traditional filters. We put the sand filter on the first floor of that pump house, so it was a little easier to get sand or things into the that building without having to take it down the stairs. But it's no secret that they'll always have to be, blowout in the winter, and then start back up in the spring. There always will be adjustment on the nozzles. Getting those like perfectly plumb is challenging, especially in moving water. But I think Newfields knew that. They had some maintenance already, so it's not a completely new fountain, although you could argue with the amount of effects that they have, it's a new maintenance effort. But it's not necessarily new that in the effort of having to drain it out in the winter. So, good question though. I thought I saw one other, yeah.
I also have two more here, kind of tangential to the fountain itself, the pathways. It looked like the one adjacent might have been limestone pavers.
Go ahead.
No, and then the one here, is that a forest?
It is, yeah. So the one adjacent to the cap is a bluestone. It's variegated, so when you're out there, you'll get a lot of blues and buffs in it, if you see that. And the one on the outside, you nailed it. It is a permeable path. It's from a company called Porous Pave. It mixes like a granite and a rubber material. And Newfields uses this up by the Lily House. And I think with the edging that's used, you get that order and definition between hardscape and softscape, which always looks very sharp and clean. But when we were on the outside of the fountain, we were cognizant of all the blooms and plantings that were there and all the trees. So we didn't want to necessarily have to excavate any deeper than was necessary. So I think the porous helps alleviate some of the impact that we were having to make to the trees there.
The second part is about the alley. Did you say it's an elm alley?
It is an elm, and you'll have to go out there and look because they don't necessarily look like elms to me now. But I've not gone out to correctly identify species between the elm. But if you're out there and you know your trees, and they do a great job of labeling a lot of them, you can try to fact check that to see maybe if they've been replaced at some point. That's where I get a little fuzzy on some of the history. Yeah.